how can a cable management company get to IT contacts in data centers? It's a great question. And a lot of it depends on a couple of different variables. For starters, we need to know, does your company just sell cable management, or are there other related products and services that you provide to data centers? The reason that that's a question that needs to come up is that defines just how tight your ideal client profile, how tight your buyer personas are in the targeting of potential IT contacts, technology contacts in data centers. The second, so how comprehensive or how narrow your product line is certainly plays a role in the kinds of job functions, the kind of titles, the kinds of different kinds of people that you need to be educating and building trust with within data centers. The second thing that plays a major, major role is the size of data centers that you're selling to, the size of enterprise data center companies or the size of data center operators that you're selling to. Generally, if you're selling to smaller data center operators, where a single person is going to have a lot of different roles and responsibilities or wear a lot of different hats, as it's often referred to, you'll have a smaller pool of the kinds of people that you need to be building awareness and nurturing and building relationships with to ultimately hope to generate revenue from some of them. If you're selling to much larger data center operators and enterprise data centers, you'll likely encounter much more specialized roles. And because there's more specialized roles, sometimes you may have different kinds of people that you need to build relationships with. So at a company level, when it comes to growing your cable management business, you'll want to define an ideal client profile. The ideal client profile lays out a couple of important parameters for the kinds of companies that you want to ultimately sell to. It lays out geographically where they're located. Can your company sell globally, or does it just sell in one particular region of the world or one particular country or one particular part of a particular country? So first, you need to answer on your ideal client profile, what's your geographic coverage? Second, what size companies do you sell to, which are big enough to be a good fit for what you have to offer, but not so large that it would be a completely different kind of sales process, sales cycle, that involves much more operational complexity than your company may be able to navigate. So there's a geographic component, a company size component, and then in some cases, there may be an industry or business model component where certain kinds of who the data center sells to, what kind, if they're multi-tenant, what kinds of industries and business models are hosted within that facility, or if they're a single like hyperscale or wholesale or enterprise, what the nature of their business is. Sometimes that can impact what kinds of companies are a good fit or not a good fit. Not so much in cable management, but in other parts of the data center ecosystem, you start to get into regulatory issues that can dramatically impact how effective your company can be, depending on whether you're able to address the compliance needs of certain specific kinds of industries, like, for example, in healthcare or financial services or something like that. So you have your ideal client profile. Once you have your ideal client profile defined, which a lot of times can come from simply looking at the commonalities among your best clients, you'll want to define who are the kinds of people within those companies, who are the kinds of IT professionals within those companies that are most important to know that your company exists and to see your company as the go-to experts in your space. That's how you segment within the ideal client profile, and you end up with a couple of different buyer personas. A buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of an ideal client that you want to do business with based on actual research and some select educated speculations. So you'll really need to, especially if you have limited resources, pick your battles and prioritize who your most important buyer persona is, your primary buyer persona, who your second most important buyer persona is, the secondary buyer persona. In some cases, you may have a tertiary buyer persona, the third most. How do you make these decisions? It's who's most profitable? What's the easiest sales cycle? Who's the best internal champion? What maps most closely to your current product roadmap and where your product roadmap is going to be 3, 6, 12 months down the road? All of those factor into how you prioritize your buyer personas. And in some cases, you may end up with a negative buyer persona. A negative buyer persona is a category of a person that you might encounter in one of these companies that just puts a whole monkey wrench in the process of being able to do business successfully. You've dealt with this kind of stakeholder over and over and over again. They're kind of toxic to your sales and customer experience process. And if you know that this person comes across your funnel or your lead generation, you want to try to exclude them out as rapidly as possible to avoid wasting resources of your sales teams. So when it comes to what a cable management company can do to get to the right IT contacts in data centers, having clarity at the company level is going to be incredibly important for building your target account list, doing basic account-based marketing. Having clarity on who the stakeholders are becomes incredibly important for how to segment and personalize your events and your messaging and your content experiences. And then once you have those buyer personas done, it's important to actually do the research and formulate, document what's most important, what's top of mind for each of these buyer personas. And you may want to spend more resources going deeper on the more important buyer personas, on the primary buyer persona and the secondary buyer persona. And for each of those, you'll likely end up with a multi-page document after you've looked at least 10 or 20 representative people in each of these segments. And on the document, you should understand the consensus on their goals. You should understand the consensus on their challenges, who they're influenced by, where they hang out online and offline. And that document, that framework, becomes incredibly important for developing a content strategy, a go-to-market strategy, an event strategy that helps you get in as early as possible and as often as possible in the right context, so that you're seen as experts, subject matter experts, consultants, trusted advisors, teachers, and perhaps even rising all the way to the level of being seen as thought leaders. That's why it's so important to make sure that when you're researching and documenting these, that you don't exclusively depend on internal input, because you may be doing this a while, your boss may be in this business for a while, but the reality is it's super important that you get their words, in their own words, how they describe their biggest goals and their biggest challenges, their biggest stressors. If you make the assumption that you know their exact words because you've been doing this for a while, you could really sabotage your efforts, and the language just may not resonate at all. So what I typically recommend is, if there's internal input, make it about 20% of what goes into documenting and preparing your buyer personas. And then in the flip side of that, make sure 80% of the input for the personas is coming from external research. The ideal scenario is where you're doing actual interviews, customer buyer kinds of interviews, face-to-face or on Zoom or something like that. If you're not able to do that, the next best thing could be perhaps running some surveys or examining a stack of their LinkedIn profiles. Look at basically how they describe themselves, look at the kinds of content they share, and do the same thing. Take those same names of the people that you're searching up on LinkedIn and looking for consensus around, and put them into a search engine, and see what comes up, and see if there's any interesting trade journals that they've been quoted in, any news releases they've been quoted in, any conferences that they've spoken at where you can watch a YouTube video. And then you roll that all together and try to find the consensus on what that buyer persona's biggest goals and challenges are. If you can't find the consensus, you may not have gotten the segmentation right. Because in order for this to be effective, you really need to be able to grab them by the virtual shirt collars as they're scrolling by on LinkedIn or wherever else you're going to intercept them, and make sure that they understand that you're speaking their language and can really help them close the gap on what they need to accomplish professionally, what their biggest individual goals, what their team goals are, what their company's goals are, and how you can help them address the biggest struggles and challenges that they're going through. What are the things that are causing them to potentially derail their career, causing them to miss time away from vacation, ruining their nights and weekends, and in general, just really being a huge pain in the you-know-what. So once you have consensus on that, it's much easier to have a content strategy, to have a content calendar, events calendar that really provides a ton of value throughout the full buyer's journey. And we need to get in early and often, because people just don't want to talk to sales teams anymore until they're at the absolute end of the buyer's journey. So we need to be in the awareness stage and in the consideration stage, and have a massive impact on shaping how they look at anything and everything related to cable management. When you can do that correctly, you will be essentially repositioning a lot of members of your sales team to get out of the transaction business and be seen more as trusted advisors and consultants and teachers. And that's incredibly important, because that makes your prospects and clients actually want to spend time with people from your team, as opposed to your team having to chase and beg and control and manipulate to try to get these meetings to happen. It's so much easier when your prospects and clients see your team as people that they actually want to spend time with, because they're like walking encyclopedias of anything and everything that's relevant to cable management, because you've seen the pattern recognition on what these kinds of companies and what these kinds of buyer personas need most throughout the full life cycle of that relationship. So you're able to share insights that not only address what their biggest questions are, but the questions that they ought to be asking that they haven't even thought of yet, because you know what's coming next. And when you do that right, not only does that make huge relationship trust building deposits into the account, but into the relationship equity account, it also can result in dramatic amounts of sales cycle acceleration. It gets rid of a lot of price sensitivity. If there's competitive bidding situations, it nearly guarantees that your company is on the short list. And in some situations, you may even completely neutralize all of the competitive forces on the short list. So by the time they get in market, by the time they get to the decision stage, your content, your events experience has been so elite, so world-class, so impactful on how that company and the decision committee navigates all of the available options, that you basically won because of the tremendous amount of value that you've added to them in helping them understand anything and everything having to do with cable management.